Welcome to session 23 of Classic Metal Class. I've got here my good friend and colleague, Scott Tarulli from the Berklee School of Music, and also a musician in his own right with a number of albums, more gigs and studio appearances than we could possibly ever list. And I'm going to be leaning heavily on Scott for this one because this time around we're talking about guitar solos. I am not a guitar player. I am at best a very mediocre bassist. Scott is an amazing guitar player who teaches the topic, and so has a lot more to say about the technical aspects of this, and even I think feel probably as well. There's something to like inhabiting a song as a musician and learning solos over and over and over again. So I wanted to kick it off. There was something that I saw today, and I shot it over to Scott, and he had an immediate reaction, which I'll allow him to replicate. But first, I'm just going to read it. So it's in Sonic Perspectives, and it's Kirk Hammett being asked about some things, and he says that people are not going to remember a great guitar solo. I hate to say it to all your readers out there. They will remember a great melody. They will remember a great song. And I'm not talking about musicians. Musicians will remember a great guitar solo, but non-musicians, who are the majority of the effing listening world, are not going to remember guitar solos. So what do you think about that, Scott?
A lot. So first of all, um, I guess his implied premise is guitar solos are self-serving
Mm,
and indulgent. Um, and well, you just said, Greg, that you don't consider yourself more of a listener than a performer, and
yeah.
yet you've written a list of solos, and you're going to be able to articulate them in the discussion today. But I could do this all day, but what if everybody goes to a Pink Floyd concert, like, or right now it's what's his name? Uh, why am I forgetting his name? He's on the road, and Dave Kilminster's his guitarist. And let's say they do Comfortably Numb, and Dave Kilminster doesn't play that solo from the record.
Okay.
He's, that's part of the song. Another Brick
Yeah.
in the Wall is part of the song. Um, there's so many. And like when I've done cover gigs, people are like, you have to play the solo exactly like, the album because, people are gonna, that's part of the song.
Yeah.
And so I kind of think it's a ridiculous statement. I don't know why he would say that if that was taken out of context. Um, I can't think of a reason why, unless he just thinks that guitar solos are self-serving, which maybe he
Well,
shouldn't do.
it seems like he's saying that musicians appreciate them and actually remember them, but non-musicians, it's just like slipping past them. And notice he doesn't say like non-musicians can't learn anything about music. He's saying they can melodies they can get.
What if the guitar
Um,
solo is a melody?
Well, that's it. I mean, some guitar solos, are, as we're going to talk about, are very melodic, very
Yes.
lyrical, right? So, in a lot of Rat, where Warren DeMartini is the lead, you and I have talked about this before. He has this very lyrical approach, and I think that the guitar solos are quite memorable. You know, when you hear like the riff, and when it gets to the break of the song. Now I've been listening to Rat since '84, since I was a kid, and so they're kind of burned into my brain. But I know, as soon as like that break comes in, Lay It Down, I know
Oh God,
exactly what notes Warren DeMartini is going to play, and I can whistle it or hum it.
everyone.
Yeah.
And just back to the point, I'm willing to bet any Metallica fan that's a
Mm.
non-musician can sing the Nothing Else Matters solo. But that's not Kirk Hammett. That's James Hetfield playing that solo. It's very melodic.
Mm.
Everybody knows that solo. So if I were to play just that solo,
Yeah.
people go, that's Nothing Else Matters. So maybe I don't know. I mean, like I think he's even wrong about, if
Well, do you think that stems from his playing style, that he's judging solos as a whole by that?
but he's heard players, he's heard music as he grew
That's
up,
true.
you know.
Yeah.
And even before I played guitar, I knew guitar solos, and certain guitar solos really excited me before I picked up music at all. And in fact,
Okay.
that's why I picked up the guitar, right? So I was a non-musician that some people were playing things that had an emotional impact on me. The notes, the execution um, came through really strong, and that attracted me to the instrument. So I I actually can't. I mean, Kirk seems like a really nice guy, man, but I don't know if how I could defend that statement in any way.
Okay.
So, but I don't
Yeah.
know. Maybe other people think differently. If anybody
Yeah. I
else,
mean, it's a good lead in, I think, for conversation. The majority of fans are going to be at best amateurs, right? Lovers of the genre, and they may know quite a lot about it, but they're probably not learning solos so as to perform them, you know?
yeah, but they might not be learning the songs to perform them.
Right, right.
Never mind, none of it. They just enjoy it. So,
Yeah. Well, let's talk about one of the reasons for bringing this up in the first place. So, Scott and I were chatting one day about solos having, kind of a lyricism to them, being beautiful and integral to songs as compositions, and that fits certain solos, right? We mentioned Warren DeMartini; he's great for that sort of thing. In a different sense, Tony Iommi is great for that, but you would never confuse a Tony Iommi solo or riff with something coming from Rat, I think. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to put Scott, more on the stage or in the dock and ask him a lot of questions about soloing and bands,
sure.
because I don't actually know that much about what goes into it. You just see the guy up on stage, or in some cases the woman up on stage playing away, and you're like, well, that sounds awesome and that looks cool, but how the hell do they do that? I don't know. So we could talk about what goes into it, but I also thought, this is something really, really integral to heavy metal. And I'm going to bring in a famous sociologist of heavy metal, Dina Weinstein, who
Oh
I'm
yeah.
a big fan of. So, in her book, Heavy Metal, the Music and Its Culture, which is a sociological study, she talks about the sonic dimension. And she, first talks about power and all that. And then she says, the essential element of complexity in the sound of heavy metal is the guitar work, which is embedded in an increasingly elaborate electronic technology that distorts and amplifies the guitar as played as a lead instrument, a musical choice that stresses its melodic as opposed to its rhythmic possibilities. And then she goes on and says, the style of play owes much to blues based guitarists who transform the urban blues guitar sound into rock. Following the blues rock tradition, heavy metal guitarists are expected to demonstrate technical proficiency. This emphasis on skill contrasts with the punk code, which emphasizes the simplicity of playing, the idea that, hey, anybody can do this. I just learned it 2 weeks ago. Punk stresses a leveling between fans and performers. Heavy metal, with its guitar heroes, emphasizes distance. And then she says, guitar solos are an essential element of the heavy metal code. A solo is a part of the song in which the guitarist does not compete with the vocalist, but may still be backed by drums and bass. It is a rhetorical element of the code that underscores the significance of the guitar. The solo was a feature of blues based rock. And here she talks about, according to Eric Clapton, solos originated with Cream, which sounds a little self serving. With only about 30 minutes of original material, they stretched it out by doing improvisational solos. The audiences loved this innovation, and the solo became a convention. Now, that's complete nonsense because there were plenty of other people doing guitar solos. But it's one of those things where I think she's right that it starts out being used for one reason. We got to fill up some space, look at what we can do. And then it turns into, it's not the only definitive thing in heavy metal. I mean, bass lines are incredibly important, the way people drum, the type of singing. And she talks about all these, as well as like songwriting and riffs. But I think you can legitimately ask a question. Can you genuinely be a heavy metal band unless you're in one of these later genres without having solos in your song somewhere. Doesn't mean every single song has to have a solo, but it does seem to be a really central part. So I think it's worth delving into, and there's lots of questions that we can raise because I don't think too many people, there's lots of lists out there. Oh, the 12 best guitar solos. There's not a lot of actual thinking about what goes into solos, what makes them great. Ken says, I agree with Scott. There's plenty of metal songs for which a guitar solo is a fundamental part of the track. So that kind of goes to that, what Weinstein was saying, that this is an essential dimension of metal. Now, Scott, you play in several different genres.
Yeah.
I mean, you can say that soloing as a guitarist for jazz is also important, right? Because there's that convention of like in a lot of jazz songs, okay, the bassist is going to do a solo, there's a drum solo, the guitarist, the pianist, who everybody gets a solo, right? But that's not quite what's going on with heavy metal songs. I mean, you do have drum solos occasionally and bass solos, but
Well, not that's a really good point to bring up because jazz, the process is completely different. So,
hmm,
um, let's say we have a trio, and let's say, and you could do it with any song. Now, real quick history: the reason there's jazz standards, um, and jazz players played on pop tunes from the 40s or 50s, and someday my prince will come. And the only reason that those were tunes that jazz players did is because when they got together to hang out, they all had heard those songs. They were kind of current songs.
okay.
And so what happens is you have the melody, the form of the tune, and a set of chord changes, the harmony. Now, if I'm with a trio and I'm soloing, I have to have my ears wide open because the drummer could completely push me a different way.
Hmm,
The bass player could even reharmonize something, and my ears have to catch on to that, and go somewhere else. So in jazz, the process of jazz is making 1 minute of music in 1 minute's time.
okay.
And so it's always going to be different, and it's going to depend on the people around you and how they are playing at the moment. Where in rock, the rhythm section might play the exact same thing every night, and you can improvise over it, but it's almost like a backing track. There can be interaction between the band and rock to some degree, but jazz is a completely different art than say metal, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
so the so yeah, it's going to depend on the moment um in jazz and the people you play with. Now, I actually just want to back up a second. I don't necessarily agree with her. uh Punk was basic and simple, so it reached, and then metal was more sophisticated, so it distanced itself. um because
Yeah, I find that a little bit oversimplistic as well.
yeah, because my response, okay, let's take early Maiden, the first
Okay.
album. More punk, more punk than what they, and I have a emotional response to that. I love it,
Yeah.
but I also have an emotional
Hmm.
response to Number of the Beast.
Steve Harris, though, is like super, super clear. And I think Dave Murray also echoed this, that although they have punk energy, they what they didn't like about punk was the sloppiness. And that early Iron Maiden album, it's tight, the everything fits together. There isn't that kind of loosey-goosey punk feel. And same with like Motorhead stuff, right? Motorhead often gets talked about as being punk and metal at the same time. But when you listen to the composition of it,
Right.
Lemmy is doing such tight, complicated stuff on his bass, doing both the bass line and rhythm guitar essentially. That it's interesting. I saw an interview recently. Well, I think I may have brought it into here. Yeah, so this is from Fast Eddie Clarke. Clark said Lemmy was just Lemmy, Phil, so the drummer, and I had to adapt to what we had to play, which was Lemmy's bass. We had to adapt to that kind of sound because it's a very difficult sound to play as a guitar player. Playing a Rickenbacker bass through a Marshall amp with all the treble at maximum and all the bass at minimum. So you can imagine there's not a lot of bass. As a lead guitarist going into a solo, it was like there was no net underneath me, And he also at some point said, and I don't have it in here, that playing with Lemmy forced him and Phil Taylor to like up their game. You know, they had to become better musicians by playing with Lemmy. And you know, so there is this punkish dimension to it, the energy, the speed, but the metal stuff requires, let's say, proficiency. And I don't know that that distances us from the performers. I mean, another thing that happens with metal that she does talk about are the performative things that the audience do. You know, headbanging is one of them. But what's the most other common thing? Playing air guitar, right?
Or yeah,
And people do that when the guitarist is soloing, and you know, obviously they're not playing the same notes as the guitarist is. They're just kind of like moving their hands around in the air. But you know, it's mimetic. They are trying to identify with the person who's up on stage with the spotlight on them, you know, making faces while they squeeze out notes from their guitar.
yeah. I so from a sonic point, I think what I'm getting at is take the Clash. I love the Clash. But
Yeah.
but take AC/DC, take uh, Adrian Smith.
Okay.
Um, so there's kind of a test that uh, I talk about with musicians from other genres. Now, like let's take a jazz somebody that plays straight up jazz guitar with a big hollow body and everything. Um, I used to get in fights with my friends younger that like, oh, jazz players could learn rock way faster than vice versa. And I said no, because there's the G chord trick, right?
Okay.
If I plug a Les Paul into a Marshall and crank it, and I hit a G chord, I have to hit it right, just right, loud enough to push everything. And like the second somebody hears that G chord, they know it's rock and roll. Like
Hmm.
Jimmy Page had it, the Punks had it. But a lot of people that don't use distortions or don't they're not able to get that sonic thing out of the chord itself. So
Okay.
that's why I'm saying that maybe the first, although it was more technical, the first Maiden album, it it still had that in common with
Okay.
when they hit an A chord, it was like that's rock and roll.
Yeah, yeah.
You take somebody that's not rock and roll, they can't get the A chord to sound like that. And it sounds ridiculous, but it's very true. Like I do a test. And I did it at a show because I have like a smaller 20-watt plexi, Marshall plexi with the, kind of a stack of a 212 cab. So it's lower volume, but I'll either go out and bend a note with some vibrato, simple, and if I could get the crowd to start going bananas just from that sound, or hitting a G chord
Yeah.
that I know I made them feel something just sonically,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's kind of my like, do I have my am I here? Is my sound there? Um, and these are kind of like little kind of tests I do to say like, okay, now you try it. Like I want to say to some people. So what I mean uh, by the comparison between the punks and metal is, I mean, metal has to have that same kind of sonic thing, or we don't feel it here.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it doesn't have to sound like punk, but it does have that kind of sonic thing we react to because rock
You
and roll
know,
in general is
and
sonic.
as you've pointed out in the past, it doesn't have to be heavy distortion in order to accomplish that. I mean,
No.
AC/DC has that heaviness and hardness with very just overdrive at most, right? There's no distortion. The guitars are very clean.
It's just a
And
little
I,
bit on it. Yeah.
and you know, I was when I was listening to some old Iron Maiden recently, I was struck, and you see this also on old Judas Priest, like prior to say Point of Entry, maybe British Steel. Um, Not a lot of distortion, plenty of overdrive. Things are crisp and clean, but heavy. And you can do that with the solo too. I mean, you can also have distortion on it and get that kind of like hollow sound to it, which is very nice. But um, So Mark has an interesting thing. Let's go off on this. I think this is going to be a session of many like going off in different directions. Hot take, I've never been too into solos, not that I don't appreciate them. To me, the riff composition is more definitive of a song as metal than its solos. Though I guess there are metal solos in the sense of a specific repertoire of lick styles that are common in metal soloing. So I think this is a great opportunity to put Scott on the spot again and talk about the difference between three different like key elements of metal and also rock songs, the riff, the lick, and the solo, because these are, I mean, sometimes a solo can be short enough that we might say it's kind of a lick, but if it's varying from line to line, I think it's more accurate to call it a solo. And a lick could be also called a fill sometimes, especially if it's like not a guitar but bass or something like that. So we've got riff, which I mean, let's start with that. So before I ask Scott to try to define riff, which may be rather difficult to do, let's actually talk about this. Is the riff for most songs more definitive than the solos? I'm inclined to agree and say, yeah, the riff is more primary, but the solo still needs to be in there. Think about Tony Iommi soloing in Zero the Hero, which is one of the heaviest songs you can find out there. It's a very, very heavy riff. You could say the same thing with another Black Sabbath song, The Devil Cries, where Dio is singing. The riff is just a monster, right? That's part of what makes it metal. But it's not just the guitar, it's the bass following along with it. But the solos in that, like I can remember the solo in Zero the Hero. Um, and probably not The Devil Cries, but so what do you think, Scott? Is the solo equal to the riff, or is the riff more important for a song?
Well, first of all, I think if I understand Mark correctly, what he means is the solos is a repertoire is made up of a repertoire of licks, right? So somebody has a
Yeah,
riff vocabulary and pieces them together. Mark, if I understand you correctly, somebody has a vocabulary, they put them together to make a solo, and we should keep that in mind um, uh, later. But to answer your question, there's no. I mean, I'm thinking of this as all of it is an ingredient to make a song. I'm not.
okay,
I mean, yeah, the riff is important because if just go to Guitar Center and you know
yeah,
kids will learn riffs. So when they're playing Iron Man, when they're playing Whole Lot of Love. When they're
yeah,
playing and though or Black Dog. Um, that somebody that's a writing process a lot in metal. Like somebody comes up with somebody like come up with a riff. All right, what about this? What about this? Okay, that's cool. Where do we go from there? So in metal,
yeah,
riffs are very signature to the song as much as the melody. Wait, I was gonna say metal music has some slicks that you won't often see in other. Well, yeah, right. Um, and that changes over time. With the solos, the metal music, the lick styles. Although the ones I'm more attracted to are the metal musicians with good ears, where they can play a melody and then embellish on that melody, rather than
okay,
then the solo comes up and they're going to play a bunch of blues licks that have nothing to do with the song, but just it's their time to like play.
yeah, yeah,
And those there's no disrespect to people that do it because sonically it can be pleasing, but I didn't choose one solo um that didn't have something to do with the song. That was like
yeah,
everything I chose was kind of unique. uh and maybe some of it involves licks, like one of them, like we talked about before, is full of licks, but how it was basically used was very kind of clever. But for the most songs, I would agree the riff tends to define songs exactly. Guitars are doing something other than simply providing sound for the singer. Iommi's nickname for the examples. Yeah. But even Kiss of Death, that opening, that's a riff. Da-da, da, 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 ba-da, da, da, ba-da. You know, like that's
Yeah, yeah.
so that yeah, I mean that's the riff in metal is usually where you start. Smoke on the Water, come on. I mean, you know. But then, then you build the song around it, right? Because if you don't
Yeah.
and it's so funny because that came up in the guitar department the other day.
That was
And
actually one of the first songs that I learned on banjo, believe it or not, because it's
I
so easy to do.
yeah, and a lot of people play it wrong, but
Yeah.
but you know, then one of I think we have this amazing classical, world-renowned Grammy classical guitarist. Her name is Berta Rosa, and so that came up, and I had my guitar and I played the riff. She goes, "Ah, but you know, do you know the rest of it?" I go, "I know the whole thing." So I started playing, you know, the verse and everything, and she's like, "Okay, I always just figured everybody just knew the riff and that's it." And I'm like, "Well,
Mm,
I'm a Purple fan, so."
yeah, yeah. Well,
Um,
let's pause on one thing though. So, lick and solo, right? You
you
could,
mean riff?
no, no, lick and
Okay.
solo. So I think you could say that, yeah, there are a lot of solos that are essentially put together of licks. So lick would be a lower compositional level than solo would be. How do you, is it possible to draw a line between them and say, okay, this song only has licks, it doesn't actually have a solo? And I'm thinking of songs where things are quite melodic, like say Detroit Rock City, right? That da 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 da
Yeah.
da da. Okay, so that could be viewed as, in some respect, a solo, but we don't really look at it so much as a solo, even when there's like the two guitar part playing
Ah,
together on it, um, which is kind of a cool element as well. But it's not licks either. It's
nope.
essentially doing a melodic work, and it's not a riff.
I would call that a
So
musical interlude.
okay. Well, that's interesting because guitar solos often get defined in the literature that's attempting to be, more highbrow as instrumental interludes, right? And so interlude works there. And what is an interlude? Well, it's doing something different. You're not stopping the song and saying,
Right.
okay, we're gonna now play a different song, but you are shifting the emphasis to something different.
Yeah, I mean, the Detroit Rock City is an amazing example. It's a new section of the tune, but instead of vocals playing the
Yeah,
melody, the guitars are playing the melody. So that's why I would say it's a different section of the song. That's not a solo.
yeah.
I mean, people would probably say anytime the guitar is in the front, it's a solo, but I
Mm,
don't agree because, like, if you played Detroit Rock City, say you and I had a band and we played Detroit Rock City, and I just noodled instead of that part, people go, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, wait! You skipped a part of the song.
yeah, yeah,
The next part does this," you know. Whereas, let's say after that, then I just ripped a solo. Then that would be more acceptable. Although some people would say you have to play what Ace played because
yeah,
Ace is classic, and but like you can't skip that part. I can't just say, okay, this is my solo spot. It's not, you know, it's a musical interlude.
yeah. So another one of the things that I grabbed off the internet is actually from Ace Frehley, and he's said these sort of things several different times. And he kind of he really likes Bruce Kulick, praises him to the sky, and then
Really?
bashes Tommy Thayer. So he
He
said,
likes Bruce Kulick. No kidding.
yeah. So he said when
I like that.
Tommy Thayer gets up there and does my solos, he tries to play them note for note, but he doesn't have the swagger or the attitude. Bruce used to play my solos, but he'd kind of make them his own and he'd switch notes a little and he had some originality. Tommy's just going through the motions. Bruce by far blows Tommy off the stage. It is what it is. And then later on, he says, I don't have anything bad to say about Tommy. It'd be one thing if Tommy would have invented his own character, invented his own guitar solos. But unfortunately, he's copying everything I do note for note. There's not much leeway for anybody to say what he's doing is original. I don't know how I could handle that. I don't think I could step up to a situation and be somebody else. It's almost like being a robot. And he said this in other interviews as well, where it's the idea is that Ace actually at one point said, I'm kind of sloppy and that's why I play so good, because things, Tommy's too precise. Tommy's like, doing it in a mechanical way, which I don't actually see. I've seen Kiss in concert a few times, and that certainly isn't part of the live performance. You don't get the idea that
Yeah.
Tommy Thayer's phoning it in. But it is interesting that he's saying Bruce Kulick was better because he took my solos and then he'd modify them somewhat, whereas Tommy Thayer's doing them note for note.
That's a great. I'm so glad you brought that up because I agree 100%. And Tommy's awesome. And look,
Yeah.
let's face it. Paul and Gene are calling the shots. Tommy Thayer is
Well,
is an
that's part of what,
employee.
yeah. They actually asked Tommy Thayer about this, and he's like, well, I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah.
I'll just say this, that I don't get to, like you said, I don't get to call the shots.
Yeah, but so he's an employee.
Yeah.
And when I'm an employee, whoever's paying me, it's my job to deliver the best I can. I do agree with the Kulick thing because you know, it is true. I mean, Ace had his own feel. I mean, I'm not
Right.
comparing him to Eddie Van Halen, but in the sense that nobody could really copy Eddie because Eddie had his own feel, and Ace had his own swagger. And when you hear that, it's just like, oh, that's right. But then you hear somebody else do it, you're like, yeah, that's the right lick, but I'm not convinced.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a real, I'm happy to hear that Ace saw the distinction, although Tommy Thayer's great.
I think there's a bit of professional jealousy involved there, though.
Yeah,
Maybe he's
that would be like him.
in thinking that Tommy Thayer is just mechanical and unoriginal and stuff like that.
But Ace knows better. Ace knows that he's an
Yeah.
employee, and maybe he's just going out there to say there's only one me. And, Ace is probably trying to say, don't be fooled, everyone. You want the real thing. It's right here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then that Bruce wasn't stepping on his toes. Maybe that made him praise.
Well,
But
Bruce wasn't putting on the makeup either.
no, and he was in an era, and Bruce was a completely different kind of guitarist.
Yeah.
Point for later. So wait, Mark, did we read this? What I do enjoy, but probably because it's rare in metal.
Oh,
Solos.
keyboards. Yeah.
Okay.
It's interesting because one of the things we're going to talk about in just a bit is Scott and I each challenged each other to come up with our 10 favorite solos. We're not going to say that they're the absolute best or anything like that because
this was impossible.
I don't think we can
Just
use
10 we like.
Exactly. And then to talk about why we like them in particular. And I went through quite a few Deep Purple things, and Richie Blackmore is great. But it's interesting. A lot of the soloing in Deep Purple, at least while Richie Blackmore's around, is him and John Lord playing together. And you can say the same thing with Mick Box and Uriah Heep. It doesn't work like that so much with Dio, where Claude Schnell is adding flavor to it and Vivian Campbell gets to just bust out. But even like a good bit of Rainbow, I think there's quite a bit of organ or keyboard involved in there. And I mean, we could talk about great keyboard solos, but
even like with guitar solos and Jans Johansson, right?
Okay.
But this is a subject for another day. I was already overwhelmed by this, and I think I went over my 10. I'm not sure. This was one of the hardest things to do.
Really? Now, why? That's an interesting thing to say.
Because I could go on for months about great solos. So
having to cap it at 10 is the challenge.
That's why I'm trying to say to everybody, these are just 10 solos, 10 of the many solos I love, and I'll just talk about these 10 for right now. Because I'm not into the. So like people, maybe you get this. What's your favorite song?
Oh,
Who's your favorite band?
I mean, when I was younger, because I've actually been asked that question about the favorite band in AMAs quite a bit. And I can say that when I was younger, like in my teens, I could have said Iron Maiden is my favorite band, right? And
Yeah.
then I could have said, well, there's these other bands that I really like as well. And there's probably like, 20 of them that I was listening to fairly constantly, some more than others. But Iron Maiden was at the pinnacle. And it just hasn't been like that for me for decades. If you ask me, I can very reluctantly put together my top 5 or top 10 or even top 20, but sometimes bands kind of move in and move out, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's to me any kind of any well, we were saying at the very beginning before we started how ridiculous those Rolling Stone top 100 guitarists, and it's just a talking point for everybody to get mad on the internet. Even Rick Beato did a, you didn't have Alan Holdsworth in there, you didn't have, and what's the criteria, and why are we getting so, I mean, it sells advertising, but there's no, it does bother
Yeah,
me. Like award shows bother me, in Boston Music Awards here. Well, it's not, let's just say none of this stuff is
it's a racket, right?
a racket. It's not a
Yeah.
meritocracy. Um, and I don't, unfortunately, I don't know if a lot of people see that. So it's like, it's funny, like you'll get like Boston's Best Jazz Act, and it'll be someone that's not really jazz and a band that's not really good, but then you have legends like Jerry Bergonzi here
Mm,
and Joe Lovano and like people that are like, people that play with Miles Davis that have stuff out that aren't even being considered. It's like,
yeah. So Ken asks like the $100 question here. Can there even be objective criteria for picking a best solo?
no.
So I would say no. I think we can have objective criteria for what sucks, where we can say, like, this is no good because XYZ. And it could also be like not about the solo itself, but about the backing song at the time. We were listening to this 80s station and a Survivor song came on. And I don't even remember what it was, but it wasn't Eye of the Tiger, but it sounded like they were trying to redo Eye of the Tiger, basically, just not as good.
Really?
And yeah, it was a plotting, boring bass track, boring riff. And then there was like a solo part. And I was, because I was thinking about our solo discussion. And I was like, this is a decent solo, but the whole song sucks and the solo sucks because of it, because the backing stuff is just so formulaic, it's not interesting.
Which
And
era? Do you know which?
I think it was from the same era as Eye of the Tiger because it sounded similar in other sonic respects. And it was something that got some airplay, but it just wasn't as good. I think Andy said it showed up in some other Rocky soundtrack. So
Oh,
it was like a montage ready song basically. And for montages that can work, right? You don't want the music to distract you from the film that's happening.
Burning Heart.
Maybe I don't
I
know,
love
but
that song. Yeah,
well, say
but that's with a
hard.
different singer. That's what Jimmy
Well,
James.
no, I don't think it was a different singer. So
Because
I don't know what song it was, but it was just kind of
okay,
mediocre. And
okay,
I think we can say that about some guitar solos. Like somebody comes in and you're like, that's just not very good, and you can say, well, why not? It sounds tired. It's you know if they are hitting interesting combinations of notes, it sounds like it's by accident, not because they actually meant to do that.
right, right, and that's a point. Does it have intention? Right.
Yeah. Now, I mean, you teach guitar, so I'm assuming that some of your students are doing solos in your class. Are there any objective criteria that you can apply to them and say, okay, your solo's not good, here's why?
I usually don't do that. I usually try to teach intention, and what intention is making your ears
Hmm,
better. For example, a starting
okay.
point could be put put your first finger on any note on the guitar. So they will. And I say play that note. And I'll say now take your time, don't play it in time, but don't play it in time. Play happy birthday without making a mistake. But take your time to think where that next note is. So if you
Okay.
could, you know what happy birthday sounds like. if you have the intention to play it on your instrument and you can't do it, then your ears have to get better. Like, if I were to sing a student something, play this, and they can't find it, that's the first thing we need to address is their ears, right?
Okay.
And then, because really all of this is subjective. Some people think Kirk Hammett is amazing. I think Kirk Hammett is a nice guy. I don't. I've never been a fan of his guitar playing. Um, None of it. You know,
Yeah.
I like the early stuff when they sounded like pissed off 18-year-olds. I did think that when he played reckless solos and they made no sense, it did have kind of a screaming. It should have sounded like that.
Yeah, yeah.
But I've never been a Kirk Hammett fan, but like, so many people are. And so I can't, it's not up to me who sucks. It's not up to me. I could describe like you did a really good job of saying why this, Frankie Sullivan blew it on some solo. And yeah, I mean, as long as, well, this is what this whole session is about is the anybody can say they like something. Can they articulate it? What's the criteria?
Right, right.
And why do you think that? And I think that becomes really important. And I try to teach my students that in, what do you like? Oh, I love this solo. What is it about you like that you like it? It's just awesome. Like, okay, we're gonna work on that because, being aware of, your what you like and find interesting could be just educational to how you put stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I enjoy watching interviews with musicians, mostly guitarists and bassists, but sometimes with singers like Dio, where he's, I mean, he knows all the instruments, where they talk about what they're doing and why they were doing it. So, for example, J.K. Lee has some videos where he's leading you through the riff for Bark at the Moon, which a lot of people get wrong. And
Yeah.
then he's like, and here's why you got to do it this way, and here's why this has to be in here to produce this effect. Otherwise, you're going to get this. Or, recently I was listening to somebody we're going to talk about in a bit, Fast Eddie Clarke, talking about what they were doing in Motorhead and why he was playing the way he was there, and then what it was like in Fastway, where he had like a traditional bassist with Pete Way, at least for a little while, and then he got replaced. But he had a 4-piece set with that. So it's, you're right. There is a lot of subjectivity to it, but being able to articulate, so I'm going to go into a very different direction. It reminds me of something that's found in Immanuel Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment, where he's very interested in aesthetics. And one of the things that was really puzzling a lot of people in the 18th century was, okay, it seems like we can have rules for all sorts of things like engineering and morals and all of that. Is it really the case that we can't dispute matters of taste? And Kant says, well, yes and no. When it comes to, and this is actually going to get to Mark's question about teleology in just a minute. When it comes to artistic or even other things like flowers, things that we find beautiful or things that we find sublime, we make judgments about them and we make them as if they are binding upon everybody, but they're not, because they are coming from a subjective basis, but we present them as if they were objective, even though they aren't. And that's why we can get into arguments about them. And then we can bring up reasons on this side, reasons on this side. But those reasons, although feeling like they're compelling, they aren't binding on everybody. But when you actually produce a really great piece of art, it has kind of an internal logic to it, which you can look back retroactively and say, aha, this is going this way because of this, and this comes together with this, and that leads to this effect over here. but you couldn't have predicted it. You can't do great art or great music sort of like in a cookie cutter, I just push this button and this happens kind of way. You have to work through it and probably do a lot of iterations and try it out. And then you produce it. And then people are like, holy crap, look at this, and you've got a good song. Now, Mark asks, what is the purpose of a good solo, other than invoking emotion, which is clearly one of the things that they do? What is it supposed to do as a solo and in the overall song as a composition? And so, it's not just decoration, right? A guitar solo is integral to metal songs, and you could have some songs like, Van Halen's Eruption, right, where it's just the guitar soloing by itself, but you don't want to have too much of that, and you don't want a guitar solo to go on too long and just be an excuse for, standing up on stage and engaging in kind of a masturbatory, show off kind of thing. This is where Zakk Wylde turned a lot of people off with Black Label Society doing like, 5-minute solos,
Of just widdly widdly widdly. And by the way,
Yes.
Zakk Wylde is an unbelievably great guitar player, but it's his attitude where it's like the pitch harmonics and as fast as he can. But you listen to like the first album, his tone, his vibrato, everything is just so good.
Yeah.
It's his attitude. Before we move on, go
yeah. So I was going to say, a guitar solo is an opportunity to stand out and do something on your own, but it's got to fit into what's that?
You mean unaccompanied?
Well, no, you could have the bass and the drums and other guitar behind you. You could even have like the singer, like every once in a while doing those kind of interjections like, "Ooh, baby," or something like that. Like David Lee Roth couldn't resist doing stuff like that, right? But it's got to fit the song. If it doesn't fit the song, and this is something you talked about earlier, but if it's just virtuosity for its own sake, then people are like, this doesn't really make sense with the song. It's cool to watch the guitar hero up there, but so imagine if Richie Blackmore and Smoke on the Water said, okay, I'm doing a 10-minute solo in the middle of this. You'd be like, well, I knew the guy was a jerk already to his bandmates, but this is over the top.
Unless he could play interesting stuff for 10 minutes, but that's not the case with most musicians.
Yeah.
And before we move on,
yeah,
this is just for me, and I think what was the Kant you cited?
It's called The Critique of Judgment, or The Third Critique, and it's one of his most puzzling works. And I think in part because he's tackling topics that are kind of messy. Like, well, how is it that we can actually have disputes about things that seem to be purely subjective and it not just be feelings, right? How can we adduce reasons for what we think or articulate reasons?
We're going to have to discuss that another time, because it's great that you brought it up, because I did, I was going to ask, hey, Greg, was there a work that has been done by a thinker that has kind of discussed this kind of, well, I know we're talking about, metal.
I mean, I will say that Kant isn't discussing music there.
Doesn't have to be music, but
yeah. I mean, there are later thinkers who do talk about music much more, including one who identified himself as a Kantian, and that's Arthur Schopenhauer, and I think that he's right, that there's some things that you can do through music that you can't do through, say, plastic arts like painting and sculpture.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but like,
no,
because you said it, and I'm like, oh, wow, I got to take. See, I need to take notes.
Let's come back to this question though. Is there? I don't know that there is a single identifiable purpose to a guitar solo.
No.
Are there like a basket of them? Like some could be just to like fill up time and space. Like, Eric Clapton talking about Cream had 30 minutes worth of set that they needed to stretch out to an hour, right? I mean, you kind of feel like jam bands do that too, right? In some respects.
Well, that's a really good point, because speaking of Survivor, I saw them years ago, and Jimmy Jamison he came in '84 on that Vital Signs album, and every song was a hit. This is years after Eye of the Tiger when the other guy left. And I mean, it's just there were so many hits, and Jimmy Jameson is like, Steve Perry. It's like those two were like the hot like rock singers to me. But there was a tune where they just did a vamp and the guitar player played a 15-minute solo over it. And I'm thinking that's 4 songs.
Yeah.
And the thing about Frankie Sullivan is he's cool, but he ran out of ideas in the first 20 seconds. Like
Mm.
it's not like he could take us on a 15-minute journey, and I wouldn't be able to just jam on something for 10 minutes. I'd get sick of myself. Like the second my ideas start to run out, I'll wrap it up. So
Okay.
it's really interesting um, from the guitarists themselves. Now back to the question is, um, it doesn't have to be a list of, does it make this checklist? I like a lot of the stuff I chose. There's going to be different reasons why they work.
Yeah.
They're not all going to be like, I'm not going to have the same answer. Oh,
What
go
do you,
ahead.
what do you think about this? Mark says the good soloist performs with moderation, even when they're like, going all out.
Amadeus.
Yeah, too
Love it.
many notes.
Which ones do you want me to take out?
Yeah,
No,
I mean, but that does go to that issue of solos that are too long or too self-indulgent. That could have been another song with the whole band, playing involved in it.
I mean, I think, let's see, the good soloist performs in moderation. Well, not always. Like one of my solos is not moderation at all, but it's a good kick in the ass and there is intention. But
Yeah,
we'll get to that. I mean, yeah, there's not, I can't, no, because for anything I would say, there's going to be a solo exist that proves me wrong.
that's an exception to it.
Yeah, I guess that's a good thing to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
What else do we have? Can a solo ever suit plurality of tastes?
So I think the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, of
I
course.
mean, because a solo can have different points to it or different purposes to it. Um, Now, I don't think that you're going to find a solo in any of this where like everybody, particularly people who are competent, more competent to judge, are going to say, yeah, we completely agree. There's unanimity about this being a wonderful solo. I think you can always find, just like anything else, you can find something to say, there's something missing, there's something too much, there's something that detracts. But I don't know, maybe we could say that there's rough consensus on, at least in the metal community, on some songs, some musicians as being really good in that respect.
Yeah. Well, this raises a really interesting question like with all this stuff that we're talking about and being able to express yourself.
Yeah.
So this is actually just for me, and I'm curious to hear everyone's take on this. Um, this show is built around two people that have an area of expertise, right? Greg. I've learned a lot from Greg, but Greg raises very interesting points for me to kind of answer. I have the years as a professional musician and different, but when it comes to my profession, I'm, and there might be other professions like this, where some people say, well, you're not any more of an expert than a layman. Like you just have an opinion, and music is
Yeah.
subjective, man, and you can't tell me what's good because, so
I mean,
now
we
that we're
actually
talking
get something like that in philosophy, where ordinary people off the street will be like, well, we're all philosophers, man. We all have ideas about stuff. And you're like,
that's not
okay,
it though.
yeah. I mean, we can all bake too, I mean, some people
Oh,
can like get a cake mix and put the eggs and oil in and put it in a pan and stuff like that. That doesn't mean I'm a chef, you know?
that's a great analogy. But I know I've been told that before, where in the music world, there's there's people that say if you know what you're doing, you're not creative. It's a bad.
And we've talked about this before. I think that's totally wrong.
Of course
And
it
when I
is.
say totally wrong, I'm not being hyperbolic. I'm not just like saying something just to like get a rise. I do think that's completely wrong. That, you know, without technique, without actual developed body of knowledge and practice and stuff like that, whether it's drawing, music, writing, you're just not, the stuff that you're going to produce will be music, but it's going to be crap music, you know? It's just, I mean, it's like playing Happy Birthday, you know? I mean, anybody can play Happy Birthday.
Right.
But, you know, playing Happy Birthday and then adding in a harmony, suddenly it starts to get difficult, you know?
Right.
So,
But yeah, and I get that from people. It's kind of and you know, I have a whole speech about it, but you know, well, if I learn music theory, it's gonna, you know,
oh,
ruin my
right.
creativity. Well, no.
Yeah.
And I always say if you're creative, no matter what's in your toolbox, you'll be creative. Whether there's three things in there, you'll be fine. If you have more things in there, you have more things to work with to be creative with. I don't know how it, I don't know where that, but like there is this kind of thing where, you
Yeah.
know, like you know going back to the Prince solo, you know, that we talked about before. You know, Prince did uh, that Beatles song, and it was a
My
good
guitar
solo.
gently weeps, I
Yeah,
mentioned. Yeah.
it was a good solo. But you know, all of a sudden, everybody's like, "This is the greatest guitarist. Who knew he was the best? This is the best solo I've ever heard." And then, you know, I'm like, they would show me. I go, "Well, I think you're reacting because he's Prince and he looks super cool, and it's a good solo."
Yeah.
But it's not. And you know, well, you're just you know, never mind you. You don't, you know, and so it's really interesting about taking the criteria. And I do remember you saying that about philosophy, like, you know, I have thoughts too. Yeah,
Yeah.
but like, you have more well-informed thoughts.
Yeah. And it's sort of like, people coming in and sort of the analogy here is people. So I'll use stoicism because this comes up all
Yeah.
the time. People are like, they'll post a problem or a question in a online group, and you're like, well, that's discussed by Seneca in this thing here. There's a resolution to that. And then somebody will be like, man, I just practice stoicism. I don't actually like to study those texts because that stifles my, you know, my living and creativity. And you're like, well, guess what? That's actually talked about in the Stoic texts. Epictetus, you know, not quite 2000 years ago, but pretty close, had people who'd come to him and they'd be like, ah, man, I don't need to study logic. I just want to like live my life and do ethics, you know, and ethics is about how to live. And then he's like, all right, go see how that works for you. And then as soon as somebody tricks you because you couldn't actually follow an argument, and you start doing something stupid and incurring some consequences, come back and we can study logic, because then you'll be in the proper frame of mind for it. But this whole like, I don't need to like study, I don't need to learn, I don't need to practice, all of that's going to like hold me back from my, I think a lot of these people like feel like they have an innate creativity, and the notion of like genius or stuff like that has been very damaging in that respect.
Right.
I mean, it's clear that some people have temperaments that are different than other people, and some people have talents. You know, I'll just give you one prime example from my family. So my great grandfather was called Pépé by everybody, and that's just sort of French Canadian for grandpa.
Oh.
And he put together a band of kids during the Great Depression and took them on a tour, and they traveled all the way out to the Rocky Mountains from Rhode Island. And he could play every single instrument. He got a bunch of instruments together, and then he just assigned them to kids. So like my grandpa played the cornet, my uncle Hubert played the trombone. And you didn't choose what instrument you got. And Pepe taught you how to play the instrument and did all the orchestration. Never had a lesson in his life, was just, you know, what we would call a musical genius. And now some of that would come from, you know, something, you know, that's innate, but that sort of thing's pretty rare. Right. And Pepe did not say, ooh, I better not have any lessons or read any books because that's going to get in the way. No, if he had the chance to actually like learn something from somebody who actually knew something, he would grab that opportunity. It just happened that he was a pretty DIY guy because he was poor as dirt. And he worked with other people who were poor as dirt, who couldn't go to a conservancy or, get music lessons or stuff like that. Now, I think a lot of people in our present society are like, I've got this hidden talent in me. I just got to express it. You probably have students who come to you like that. Fortunately, we don't get a lot of people like that in philosophy, coming to take classes with us who are like, I'm a great philosopher. I just need to like learn a few things. So, getting them to understand that, no, learning things, learning what other people have done, learning what they think, learning what they think works and doesn't work, that's not going to stifle you. That's actually going to open doors for you and allow you to progress, you
Well,
know?
yeah. I think the big thing is students will come in and they'll be the hometown hero and they'll have some licks and
Mm.
they can play some fast solos and they kind of think they're there. And then, well, they can't read. Okay.
Yeah.
Like, well, Eddie Van Halen couldn't read. Eddie Van Halen, that wasn't part of his journey. And then, okay, well, you can improvise if we're in key. Now I'm going to write these three chords.
Yeah.
What chord is that? Well, you better figure it out because you need to improvise on it right now. And then, after a few semesters, when they're not doing this stuff, I'll go, I'll put reading in front of them and I'll go, okay, you need to read that. I can't. Oh, too bad because there's this gig tonight that pays $700 that I can't make.
Yeah.
So,
With Eddie Van Halen, so this is something I really want to ask you about in terms of musical development. So Eddie Van Halen and the, people that he was connected with in the band early on, they had this very long, difficult apprenticeship. They learned over 100 different cover tunes
oh yeah.
and they played them night after night after night after night. And they practiced, hours and hours a day. And you're going to learn other people's solos as part of those cover tunes and figure out how to make them your own, right? And you could say, oh, well, that's not being original. Well, it's sort of like, walking in somebody else's shoes. You're going to learn a lot of things along the way that you wouldn't have learned just doing it entirely on your own. And then once he starts to develop his own stuff, it's not as if he just like got up there and noodled and like the inner creativity came out. I mean, he was practicing his stuff
Yep.
hours and hours a day, right? So, you know, I guess so there's your students, but even like great musicians, they're still learning from each other, right? We can talk about somebody like Dave Murray influencing other guitarists,
Okay.
younger guitarists, right? And if you want to be able to play like Dave Murray plays, you're never going to be Dave Murray any
No,
more than you're going to be Ace Frehley.
no.
But you
Right.
can follow their solos. And what is it that you actually learned? I mean, I'll ask you, I'll condense it to this because you're somebody who has learned a lot of other people's solos. What were you actually learning when you were playing along with their solos and like listening to them and thinking about them, not just making your fingers move in the right ways? What were
Th-
you getting out of it?
This is a great question. Early on, it was I knew the pentatonic scale because I was taking lessons, and I kind of knew the minor scale. So I recognized when I would learn solos, rock solos, kind of what was going on in them.
Mm,
Now here's the thing. Um, I do a lot of stuff that's within a rock solo that takes the ear in a different direction, and people go, "Well, what's that?" And I'll say, "Well, I bought a Herbie Hancock record and I transcribed all of it. I wrote it all out. It took, a few weeks and I matched all the solos. But because I have a foundation in theory and understand triads, sevenths, I understand harmony, I could say this is a G7 chord and he was playing this arpeggio over it. And that would mean this is going on. So because I have a solid foundation and being able to look at a transcription and say, wow, well, I didn't know you could do that, but he's doing this, and I guess that makes sense because it comes from this pitch set.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
essentially took lessons from Herbie Hancock because it's all there. But if I didn't know what I was doing, I would just be copying the notes, and maybe I get a technical exercise out of it. But then I could say, wow, he took this pentatonic scale and added a flat nine for this chord. I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to, do it in my own way. So um, nobody's, this goes back to, everybody that has that badge of honor. I'm self-taught. Well, everybody's everybody's self-taught. I could sit here and tell you theory all day, and it's up to you to process it and make something happen with it. Because the only way you're really self-taught is if you were born in a bubble and you never heard music and you invented it. But people that claim they're self-taught, most of them, copied Jimmy Page or copied, and they have those licks of that
Yeah.
vocabulary. But
I
like,
mean, you would have to grow up in a complete vacuum, and then how the hell would you even know that you want to play rock and roll?
yeah, well, we give you an instrument, and now you're self-taught. But I don't understand, if you're learning from YouTube, would it matter if the person was next to you?
Yeah.
Or if they're on YouTube, and I don't quite understand the badge of honor because, I run into people all the time. Well, how do you make a living as a musician? Well, I have a set of skills. I could do rock and roll and not think of anything and have fun. I could do my own music. I could do whatever I want. But when it comes to paying the bills, I have a set of skills that makes me employable, especially this day and age. It's
Yeah.
so that's when people start to realize like, you know and at least when I started out, there was so many gigs. I was making a lot of money for a 21-year-old. They don't really exist as much anymore, but
Yeah.
with the skills you can earn a lot. But um
So Ken has something interesting here, and this is going to lead into something that Richie Blackmore said. Being good at guitar solos requires knowledge of music, skill, and practice to maintain skill levels. I would suggest that playing a musical instrument is very much a perishable skill. I'd imagine the same could be said of implementing philosophy in life. And I'd say, yeah, you do always have to like practice, and people who stop practicing, they they go backwards. Now, I want to offer an opposite to this. Richie Blackmore was asked in an interview, are there solos you played with Deep Purple that stand out in your mind? And he says the solo in Highway Star was worked out. It's just arpeggios based on Bach. On Machine Head as a whole, in fact, there's some good stuff. The guitar solo on Pictures of Home was good, but when I hear that compared to what I'm doing now, there's a big difference to me. It's much better now. I didn't have the control then, I do now. So we think about like his classic period, Deep Purple, Rainbow, and he's saying, I was good, not as good as I am now. I've developed more control. He does also say, I think the solo on Gates of Babylon on Rainbow's Long Live Rock and Roll is the best solo I've ever done. It's the best because it's the most intricate solo, but it's not clinical. It was spontaneous. It wasn't 24 bars of just playing on E. There's weird chords involved that I could go back to my old way of playing, which is to have the chords in front of me and play the solo. Whereas now, every time I go into the studio to play, I know exactly what the song consists of, right? So a couple different things there. One is like Blackmore himself is like, yeah, I still needed to improve. I was a guitar hero back then, top of the world, but you can still get better, which is kind of a cool idea, kind of inspirational. And I don't think, a lot of people talk about Richie Blackmore being inspiring
I mean,
because
he's playing, let's just say that.
yes, exactly, as a person. But then also this idea of like Gates of Babylon, why was the solo so good? Because he had to work around weird chords rather than just playing a typical straight ahead, kind of heavy metal riff.
Or like say in one position or one scale or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. So I
um,
mean, what do you think of those two things?
well, there's a really good point about people that stop practicing. So
Oh,
people, there's different types. Like let's take um, a legendary band like and or a guitarist, and they sound the same now that they did 30 years ago. But that
okay.
probably means that they, stopped really working on stuff, and then just by playing, they're maintaining it, right? And
Yeah.
for me, as far as like the technique I need, I'm one of those people that I do need to. I feel like I need to maintain my technique because I have a couple friends in town that never play their guitar but have unbelievable technique, and they go, "You don't need to practice; it's just there." But I have a joke. I'm like, man, I lose my chops in a 4-bar rest, So, but I'm also practicing new concepts and um, new things that I can't do, and I'm
Yeah.
always
Yeah.
working on my ears. Ears are fundamental, but they can always get better. Believe it or not, I still work on my sight reading, but I really work on how I approach things, putting notes together as sounds and not calling them chords. And I keep reaching for new sounds, but so I'm always reaching to sound better, but there's some people that they stop at some point and they're great, they're amazing, and they just maintain it by playing, which there's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with. I mean, once somebody's just developed their sound and style,
I mean, there is a certain good to being able to just keep doing a good job at what you've learned to do, right? Um, and that could be in music, that could be in artwork, that could be in cooking. Sometimes you want meatloaf. It doesn't have
right,
to be like deconstructed or have, new spices in it or something like that. We call that comfort food, right? And maybe there's comfort
right.
music. Like when people go to see REO Speedwagon, they're not expecting to hear anything new. You know?
That's so, and yeah, that's kind of like last week, and I was a huge Speedwagon fan in high school. I was a huge fan of a lot of people. And
Yeah.
when I used to see them in the '80s, they used to do most of the new album. They had a few that they always did anyways, but now they have a lot of these bands have, this is off subject, but they have live hits. In other words, the songs were never hits on the radio, but they're always part of their set. Like
Oh yeah, yeah.
The REO does like Keep Pushing every show, but that was never a hit.
Yeah.
But it
I was
has to
just
be in every
I
show.
was just laughing because with bands like Iron Maiden who couldn't get airplay to save their life for a long time, basically every hit had to be a concert hit
Rhyme of the
because
Ancient Mariner,
yeah,
or
yeah,
uh,
you're not going to hear Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner on too many radio stations because it's, what, 14 minutes long? So, or is it 12 minutes long? I mean, it's very long. So,
yeah,
I mean, they will play other crazy long songs like Inagata Davida or
on the classic. That's right.
yeah, or Hocus
Or
Pocus is Procol Harum, but
what
yeah,
about um, what about the live version with the 3-minute rant of Musta Got Lost, Jay Giles band? Do you remember when they used to play the 5-minute rant at the beginning?
no,
Reputa the Buta. I don't know. It was like that was maybe because they were a Boston band, but it was like
yeah,
it's
yeah,
called I Must Have Got Lost, and it was like the intro alone was like 4 or 5 minutes of like Peter Wolf just giving this whole rap
dialogue.
about,
Okay, yeah.
and but yeah, so that I think now they
Well,
probably cut that off.
I think we have to get to something that we were going to talk about, namely, and we're not going to get through all of them, but some of the solos that we think are particularly stand out as great, and what's so good about them. So, do you want to pick one of yours first?
Okay, and this is in no specific order. The first one I'll say is Dio's Last in Line with Vivian Campbell. Now, this was hard because there's a bunch of Vivian solos I really liked. Uh,
Yeah.
the thing I really like about, I always loved about Vivian, I almost chose, uh, anyways, in the Last in Line solo, it has a very interesting, you know, uh, intro line, ba da da da, and that just alone is kind of setting up this kind of dark, moody thing.
Yeah.
And something, oh, it's something that I loved, and he was younger, right? He was like 17, 18 years old. The thing that I always loved is there's this part where he hangs on these notes like ba ba ba,
Yeah.
and back then that took a lot of guts. But
He doesn't feel the need to like fill up the sonic space with like lots of going up and down.
so like that, but emotionally that hit me the most. That was kind of like this lonely, kind of dark.
Yeah.
And then the drums kick in, and he starts at and then that kind of rhythmic thing, and then he starts going with some of the Chuck Berry licks, and then he does like start cooking at the end. But um, it's it's in the end gets exciting, and he does show his technique there. But I always just was floored when he would play solos. He would be fine leaving these notes hanging for two or
Yeah.
four beats, and
Holy Diver, which is one that I
that's
picked.
yeah, that's the one.
I mean, that's the very early part of the solo is over. Not exactly sure how to describe it technically, but it's that da-dun, da-da-da-da-da-da, da-dun, So one of the things that was really cool about Dio's compositions, and this is as a whole, like the riffs, is that there's space in there. There's a willingness to like, there's a melodic line that's carrying through, and it can have like a gap in there here and there. Bob Daisley was good with that on bass too, with Ozzy's early stuff too. Um, and the solo is kind of, like you were saying, it's not that the solo's slow, but it's deliberate at the start, and then it starts getting into a more like going through arpeggios and stuff like that. And by the end of the solo, it's soaring. So I guess you'd call that dynamic aspects, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's the one I was gonna pick first.
Okay.
But he does those. It's a technical term, but quarter note triplets. Da 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 ba ba da 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 da.
Yeah.
Wow. Where did you hear that in solos? It's just kind of like he's like pulling you back, and he's not in a rush, and and that's the stuff. Even when I was younger, when a young teenager, it was like kind of like fast, fast, fast. But
Yeah.
always respond to the fast, fast, fast. I just thought Vivian. I also I also think that sometimes you think you have people have a lot of courage doing that, and I'm suspecting that Ronnie James Dio was really supportive of that stuff, and made it okay, because I know Rowan Robertson, who was on Lock Up the Wolves, said that Dio was amazing to work with on Lock Up the Wolves, and that he was so
Yeah.
encouraging, and he was such a great direction. I'm assuming that Ronnie had to do with, no, play that. I like
Yeah.
that. Where at that time it's like, God, I'm going to be on the greatest singers album, and everybody's going to judge me that I'm not good
Yeah.
enough.
Well, I read something really interesting that supports that. Originally, Jake E. Lee was supposed to be the guitarist for Dio's solo act, and it makes sense because Dio was managing Rough Cut at the time. Uh, um, Jake E. Lee was from the LA scene. He'd been in Ozzy's band. Well, no, he's in Ozzy's band afterwards. He went over to Ozzy's band,
Yep.
but he'd been in Rat and Rough Cut and stuff like that. And when Dio brought him in, he's like, "You've got to play harder, more straightforward, less complicated riffs. That's what I want you to do." And he and Jake E. Lee couldn't see eye to eye on that.
No
And
kidding.
so it's not going to be like think about Bark at the Moon, right? It's a very cool riff. It's like iconic these days. It wouldn't fit into a Dio song. Campbell was the right guy at the time for that sort of thing, and I think it's reflected in his soloing. You know,
Yeah, and now, since he's been in Def Leppard, he has no problem playing half the solos that Phil Collins plays. You know,
yeah,
he's um from what I've heard, I haven't met him, but what I've heard, he's like the sweetest guy you ever want to know. So I think from the beginning, he might have had ego uh out of it, but like
yeah,
he had chops, man. Like when he wanted to go, he went, but it's just
yeah,
he didn't. He really, those long notes always struck me. And so I was gonna do that one, but I chose Last in Line because I
Yeah.
kind of like how the band kind of builds it up together, and
Oh
you,
yeah, it's amazing
you can hear the
stuff.
commas and the periods at the end of sentences when he's making his statements. And
Yeah.
but
And this is, we talked about this in a previous session. When people are asked like what's the best Dio album, if we put aside the Rainbow and Black Sabbath stuff, people usually are going to pick Holy Diver. I think Last in Line is actually Holy Diver is an amazing album. Last in Line is even better, I think. And I think part of that can be attributed to the people who are playing on it.
I love those albums so much. Although,
Yeah.
be Mr. Unpopular opinion, I love Sacred Heart.
Yeah. I mean, there isn't a bad Dio album, you
Yeah,
know.
Rock and Roll Children,
Yeah.
King of Rock and Roll. I
Yeah.
mean, that album got the most spins from me. But
Let's
I love them all, but yeah,
let's
that.
talk about, so we've got a couple others where you and I both pick the same band, but I think
Oh
we're going to
yeah.
have somewhat, so let's look at the Scorpions one, because there we got two different guitarists, right? And one of them is not the one that you'd expect. So you picked off of Virgin Killer, Catch Your Train, which I love all that early Uli von Roth or John Roth stuff. He's just an amazing guitarist, but he does have a very different feel than Matthias Jobs, who I'd describe as a little bit more straight ahead as a guitarist than I mean John Roth was like all over the map. Just I mean, you could tell that he was somebody that he had complete fluidity with his instrument. And I picked Animal Magnetism, the title track, Animal Magnetism, because it's got that, dun, 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 da, da, da riff to it, right? And then there's that soloing over it that's, it's kind of unconventional. It's that, kind of just playing over that riff and never doing anything really spectacular, but it makes the song so heavy. That's Rudolf Schenkner, not
Yeah, I didn't know that
Matthias
either.
Jobs. Yeah, I mean, I had to look it up on the Wikipedia. I was like, I just want to make
Mhm.
sure that's because I was confusing it with Love Drive, where Michael Schenkner had played on a few of the tracks, right? And I was like, I better make sure it's not Michael Schenkner. No, it's Rudolf Schenkner, who rarely solos at all. But on that one, he was dead on. And Rudolf Schenkner is content to sit back and be the band leader and songwriter and make everything work most of the time. But on that one, he really knocked it out of the park, you know.
Yeah, oh yeah. I did not know. Well, see, I learned something. And I kind of
Yeah.
did the same thing. Like unless I knew for sure, I kind of checked things out. So
Well, you have to, I think,
yeah.
right? Especially if they've changed guitarists. So tell us about Catch Your Train and why you picked that one. I mean, there's so many great uh Willie John Roth solos.
Yes.
Why
You know,
that one in particular?
um, there's a lot of rhythmic variation in his solo in that one. And just the way he attacks the notes, I like his sound, like how he picks the sound he gets out of his fingers, but the rhythmic variation, and on that one, it fits the song. But you know, I don't know the answer to if he wrote it or improvised it, but it
Mm.
sounds. If you write something, it should sound improvised if it's really written well. And to me, that sounded like he was stretching for something and they caught it on tape.
Oh, wow.
And like
Okay, that's a
just
great description. Yeah.
and maybe I'm wrong, but like, it's just, I always found him such a creative player. Like, we were all talking about licks before. Someone that's like, I don't want to fall into that. I want to discover something. And I've always liked him as a player. And what I did, what I told Greg at the beginning of this is I actually went back to some albums I hadn't listened to in over 20 years, and I went back to that album, and then I was like, I remember this, and I was like, geez, this solo is just, and I actually listened to it a lot. I'm like, this is like, and you think of
Yeah.
the time period too, and as I always say, it's like, what was that, 75, 76?
Virgin Killer, I want to say 70, 77.
maybe. So,
Yeah.
I always say, just as far as the invention of the rock band would be February 9th, 1964, when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan. That's when everybody wanted to be in a band. I'm not saying that's where rock and roll started. I'm just saying that's where the concept of everybody wanted to be in a band.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, I mean, you have to think at the time, we're like 12 years after that or something. And, for somebody to kind of have that sound, have that time variation and the creativity. And if it wasn't, it sounded like, he was in the studio and reached for something and then they caught it. That's what I really like about it. And it's not
Hmm.
like one of those, he wasn't self-indulgent. It fit the tune, but it was just, I like things that surprise my ears. Like, sometimes you could tell what the
He's good about that, you know.
yeah, and I like that in compositions too, where there's like a new section or a new chord that perks my ear up, going, "Oh, that's new." And I like that in guitars where they're like, "Here you go," like "Oh, we're somewhere else." I'm like, "Oh, I didn't expect that. Where are we going now?" Like, and it becomes kind of an adventure within the structure of the song. So that's why I picked that one.
Yeah. Let's pick one that Ken also mentions the same band. So Iron Maiden, you and I both picked Iron Maiden, and there's so many great solos because there's two
So
amazing guitarists, Dave Murray and Adrian Smith. I mean, Dennis Stratton on the first album as well.
yeah, sure.
So Ken says it would have to be the lead in and final solos in To Tame a Land from Peace of Mind. And now that's an interesting one because it's such a long song, right? So there's lots and lots of room for solos in it. And it is driven by the lyrics. It's about Dune. They actually wanted to call it Dune, but Frank Herbert wouldn't sign off on that because he hated heavy metal. And so
Really?
yeah, so they had to call it To Tame a Land. And it's I mean I think it's 7 minutes long. So there's lots of room, and it's a very um I mean, there is like a important bridge in it, that da 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 da, that section there. But there's some great solos in that. That's really quite
That's a
true.
good one. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to pick with Maiden, right?
It,
So you picked the off the Power Slave album, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Um, And now talk about a long song. I think that one tops off at 14 minutes, and it's also got that really cool bass interlude in there as well, with the
with the volume swells.
yeah, exactly, yeah, and then the Bruce Dickinson reciting the poem over that, right? But there are some great solos, like on that whole album. But I mean, Iron Maiden has quite a few long songs would give you more space to do an extended kind of take your time solo, right?
Well, there's not. I mean, there's a set amount. So, well, I guess let's start here. So the middle section starting it does, and then we pick up with a da 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 da, and then it starts to grow, and
Yeah.
and then it kind of goes into this halftime, da 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 da, and then it goes into that riff, da 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 da, and man, when Adrian Smith comes in with that first note, with that vibrato, now it's kind of bluesy licks, but you can sing it. And
Hmm.
Adrian Smith has this grease on his playing, the
Okay.
vibrato, and he leans a little back into the time, right? So he's not like Dave Murray is very on top of the beat, right? He's right on the beat, and Adrian
Yeah.
a little behind the beat. And there's a few surprises, like he'll play like these riffs and then like he'll skip a beat and then this note kind of comes out of nowhere that's very singable, and then at the end he goes into this like kind of like double time like riff to like wrap it up, and then like as a nice cadence da 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 da, like he kind of slows it down, which is a great lead in for the next solo. But I just, I mean, it's hard to pick a Maiden solo. I mean, I could have gone to any album, but Adrian, I've always been a huge Adrian Smith fan, and like I remember watching Live After Death, and like that was my favorite part. Like when Adrian would step up with the rock and roll,
Yeah.
and with that feel and that vibrato and that tone, he's just got it, man. It's just, you know, what what a great, but like, yeah, that solo's always just got me because of that. It's singable, it's his time, it's his little surprise with those notes getting stuck in there, and yeah, I out of all of the Maiden, I just picked that one.
Yeah. So I picked off a number of the Bs. So we got, album 3, 4, and 5 here in our mix. 22 Acacia Avenue. Another longer song,
Yep,
I think it's six something long. And there's two big solos in the song. Lots and lots of great licks, but there's two solos. And one is in that slow part of the song. It's very lyrical, it's
yep.
dreamy, there's reverb on it, and I don't know if it's Murray or Smith who's playing that one, or both, alternating. But it's just beautiful, and then towards the end of the song, once they've picked up the pace and they've done that, don't you know what you're doing, you'll see it lead you to ruin, Charlotte, you're taking your life, throwing it away.
That's
They lead into that second solo, and it's just blistering.
that's
They
that's that's Adrian.
Okay,
Yeah, you're right.
but
You
it
know,
it goes on. That solo it's the outro to the song, and I'd say that solo goes on for at least 45 seconds, maybe a minute.
doesn't get boring either. See
That's
what I
right.
mean?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, he's got ideas, and a lot of that's what we were talking about earlier. That you
You
know,
know, under it too. I mean, you have Steve Harris, and that amazing bass line to it that's got so much energy. I mean, that's something. I've always loved Iron Maiden. I'm not as big of a fan of later work because it doesn't feel like it has the same sort of energy that those first six albums have.
although I did like Brave New World a lot.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that they have any like crap albums, but there's when you set the bar that high, it's hard to constantly match it. But this also leads into another interesting question. So when you got two great guitarists, so you could think of Iron Maiden with Dave Murray and Adrian Smith. I mean, when they get Dennis Stratton wasn't bad, but he's no
No,
Adrian Smith, and then you think about Judas Priest with its original configuration with KK Downing and Glenn Tipton, now essentially replaced both in concert stuff. Or I mean, what would be some other really? I mean, you could say Rat, but Robin Crosby was content to sit back and play rhythm and let Warren DeMartini take over his lead, and he does most of the solos.
he wasn't content. He was really resentful, actually.
That's interesting because I've read some interview. I think there's like mixed signals about that.
Oh,
There's some interviews where he's like, "Yeah, I recognize the kid, had more talent than me," and you
oh,
know,
okay,
yeah.
all
But
right.
in any case, we can't talk about them being analogous to.
No,
Now, interestingly, when Rat played live in the latest, like legitimate configuration of the band, where it was, you know, uh, Warren DeMartini with Juan Crozier and Stephen Percy, but they had Carlos Cavazo
right.
as the replacement for Ryan Crosby. I think what that did is up the game, because Cavazo's not just playing rhythm guitar; he's also soloing with DeMartini.
And
You
he's a
know,
legend in the scene from the same era.
exactly. Yeah,
So he was there, kind of thing.
yeah.
Mm,
I mean, people talk about like Thin Lizzy as having a great two guitar thing, and yeah, I mean, I don't
Yeah.
consider them metal. I consider them more hard rock. Scott Gorham and Brian Robertson together, pretty awesome. But are there any other like really great classic metal outfits with two really great both rhythm and lead guitarists that come to mind for you besides Priest and Maiden?
Well, there should, but I would like to say the difference between Priest and Maiden is when I was listening to Priest, by listening, I couldn't tell who was playing lead
That's
because
interesting.
they were very similar.
Yeah.
Maiden, you knew by the first note who was playing the lead. They were so different in style. And
Yeah.
when they played the harmonies, like you think Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, how long
Yeah.
and how many sections, they sound great together, but they're such entirely different guitar players. When it was Priest, I'd hear a solo and go, which guitarist is it? And it's not a put down because I love the guitarist. It's just they were more like each other. God,
Yeah, and I think so. I included from Sin After Sin the song Sinner, which is awesome, and has some really great guitar soloing in it. And as Judas Priest's sound changes, what we talked about earlier, from the overdriven to the kind of
right.
distorted sound, I think you're right that KK Downing and Glenn Tipton, they both changed their sound in the same way, you know.
Right. Yeah. I agree. Um, yeah, I like the earlier ones like Maiden, it's definitely Marshalls, just turned up and that's it. And now they're pretty distorted, it's pretty heavy. And I'm always kind of curious when you see bands that were classic, like, why aren't you playing the classic amps, Um, do you have them? Those are kind of lame questions I would ask.
Yeah.
But
Well, let's actually veer off into Mark has a great question that Ken also has a interesting response to. And then we'll pick the other band that both of us
okay.
identified. So Mark says, question for all, the most overrated solo. Mine would have to be Sweet Child of Mine, simply because it's one of the usual suspects when guitar bros want to show off. Ken says something really interesting. For me, it would be Paranoid. It's done to death, and I think even Tony would admit for a guitar solo, it's pretty simplistic. Now, I don't have a I think it's overdone guitar solo, because I don't like hang out in Guitar Center or anything like that and listen to all the bros come in and riff over one thing. But Scott, I mean, you have students who are trying to show off their chops. Would you say, first of all, what do you think of those two? Um, and then are there any that you're like, oh man, if I don't hear that again, it'll be too soon?
I don't know if it's overplaying. Like, I think the solo to Stairway to Heaven is
Mm,
one of Jimmy Page's best. But I don't need to hear Stairway to Heaven again. But
okay.
but that solo is one of my favorite Page solos. Now, Sweet Child of Mine, this is a great one because we were around when Appetite came out, and that album rocked. I love the album and the tunes, but I didn't really think of Slash as like, I thought he played the riffs cool. Like I love Mr. Brownstone. I love um, Night Train. I love that riff, and that was rock and roll. But the Sweet Child of Mine solo, and even the Sweet Child of Mine lick, it was okay, you know.
Yeah.
And and then
Yeah, I can like hear it in my head right now. That do 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 do. It's kind of, it's very musical, lyrical.
yeah, but
Um,
I don't think it's executed. I mean, it was fine. I mean, it was kind of like I didn't think of him like a great lead player. I thought like, yeah, it serves a tune. It's cool. It's like get a rock and roll guitar solo.
yeah,
Let's
yeah,
but let's go to present day. Somehow he's become the face of rock guitar gods, and I didn't see that coming. You know, because when it came out, it was kind of like, well, this is the next generation of Joe Perry. Cool, love Joe Perry, love Aerosmith,
yeah,
and
yeah,
for us now, for everybody, it's just kind of like Slash. Like, believe it or not, the young students at Berkeley don't know much about rock history, but they don't know who Slash is. And they know him as kind of like the rock legend, which I don't know if it's just because I was there when they came out and it was a great album, but nobody was like, Slash, like this is the guy. So, yeah, I think the solo, I don't know if I should use the word overrated, but yeah, I know exactly what you're saying because
yeah,
it wasn't something that I was like, I need to learn this when I heard it. I thought, cool, it's time for rock and roll guitar solo. This is cool. But like to say like, like I'll be on, once in a while I'll do like a a corporate gig, and they basically call tunes, and I know too many tunes. They're like, oh, you know, Sweet Child of Mine, yes, you know,
Can
um,
tell your enthusiasm for it.
yeah, and then but you know, I play the solo pretty much. I mean, I never sat down and learned it, but I you know, I
Yeah.
hear it in my head so I can play it. Um, and you know, people do go nuts when I play the solo. They go crazy, you know, and I'm like, okay, well, he did something right, I guess, you know, because it's part of the tune. So that's overrated solos. Yeah, I mean,
Now,
the
Paranoid is an interesting one because it is such a short song. I want to say um it's three no it's 2 minutes and 48 seconds, so I was going to say it's not even 3 minutes. So there's not a ton of room in there for doing much of anything. I suppose it's probably learned a lot, um in
yeah,
part because it's part of the repertoire, you know.
and, this is you got to remember this is very early on. This is
Yeah,
the roots. You know, we can argue that they're you know part of the beginning of metal.
right. Yeah.
Some people say they were. You know, I don't want to point to one band, but they are certainly, coming up with something.
I would
And
call them the first among equals, you know.
yeah,
So along with like Deep Purple, Uriah Heep,
right.
Sir Lord Baltimore, you know, but Black Sabbath sits above them,
And people
you
even
know.
say Zeppelin, you know.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
But like, you have to think like, the riffs were amazing. And this was, if we went back to those times, we might hear it differently in that. I know what you mean, but like, going back, pre all the other stuff, we might go, oh, okay, so that's
Yeah.
it's pretty cool. Uh,
Let's talk about Rat, and then we'll each pick one more
okay.
from our list. So you picked one off of invasion of your privacy, not invasion in your privacy. And so did I. And it's kind of funny because, you know, is that their best album? Well, it's not what they play the most of in concert. I mean, what they play the most of is
Out of the cellar.
Out of the Cellar, right? Yeah. Invasion of Your Privacy, usually they'll play 2 or 3 tracks from it. And Out of the Cellar, they'll play not quite half the album, but a good bit of it. But maybe some of the best solos are actually on there. So you picked here it is, You're in Love, great song, right? And it's got that part. I mean, the solo is taking place over a change in the chord progression, right?
Exactly, which happens a
Yeah,
lot with them.
that's true. Yeah, it's so like the solo is actually part of a bridge, isn't it?
Well, my second choice was Never Use Love, which does the
That's
same
a
thing.
yeah, yeah,
It goes to it actually goes to kind of the same chord. Um, it's hard because Warren's one of the greats, I think, in that era.
the
So,
one that I picked, Lay It Down, it's
oh yeah,
a chord progression change too, as well, on the
oh
rhythm.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and I think I told you, Lay It Down when I saw him live in the '80s. They brought it way down to that, when it goes down to like to,
yeah, yeah,
and they kept that going. And Warren actually played for a good 5 minutes or maybe 10 minutes over just that, and it never got boring. He sat there with a cigarette with with spotlight on him, playing some really nice phrases, and he did not run out of ideas. I remember going, and I was
yeah,
somebody
yeah.
even back then. I'm like, oh God, like somebody's gonna get up and do an unaccompanied solo, go whittly whittly whittly. Here's my, yeah. So, but anyways, did you want to talk about your
Well, I would pick Motorhead's Overkill, which is or Capricorn off of Overkill, which is probably one of my favorite Motorhead songs. And it's kind of unusual in that it's slower, it's more open, in its composition. And Eddie Clarke, he's so great at like producing these solos that are just kind of dreamy. There's a lot of like fatness to the sound and a little bit of reverb in there, and he's not trying to like show off or anything, but he's just producing like this almost like a web of notes over what. And like he said, he doesn't have a net beneath him. All he's got is Lemmy and a drummer, and that's it. So as opposed to a lot of songs where you can rely on the other guitarist or a keyboardist or somebody to like hold down the riff,
Right.
he's got to fill it all up.
Yeah, that's it. I like what you said at the beginning of how he expresses thoughtfully how people have to sonically find their place, you know,
Yeah.
and then adjust their playing somehow. It's like Alex Lifeson talks about when they got keyboards, he had to change his playing entirely to where he was
Mm.
in the higher register, how he had to come up with different parts. And I love when people talk about, I had to find a way to make this work, which
Yeah.
means,
Yeah.
they're in the mind of like, and then you can say, well, they put thought into this. They didn't just get together and throw spaghetti at the wall to see if it would stick.
Yeah.
So I really like the story you told earlier, and now that you're talking about the solo, uh,
Somebody else outside of the metal range that reminds me of is Peter Hook. Um, he's a bassist, right? But he plays a lot in the high range.
oh
And
yeah,
he's in essentially two iterations of a similar band, right? Let's call it. First, I'm blanking at it. It's New Order after, and it's Joy Division.
oh
Um,
okay,
and the reason why he played those really high melodic bass lines was because he said that he had a tiny little amp, and the guitarist was playing too loud. So the only way he could actually hear himself was playing stuff in the high end. So he just sort of made a virtue of necessity and stuck with it. And it's part of his signature style. And, when you see him in concert, which we did here in Milwaukee a couple of years ago, he has a bassist playing with him, and he uses the bass essentially as a solo instrument.
oh, see, that I was gonna ask, like,
Yeah.
eventually, did he get a low end, because that might be missing in that context.
Yeah. Yeah. But on those early songs, the bass is very much, I mean, he does sometimes drop into the lower strings, but he's mostly on those two higher strings, and pretty high up on the fretboard too, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
So
perfect. Yeah, perfect sonic example.
so who would you pick for the next one? And then we'll see what Ken and Mark want to say about like
What we
best
think.
solos, favorite solos.
God, I have a bunch left, but I'm gonna pick I'm gonna pick one that has a totally different criteria just to get it in.
Interesting.
So one of them I picked was Whitesnake from the 1987 album, of course, John Sykes, who I've always been a huge fan of. Crying in the Rain. Now here's uh now that's it's kind of a bombastic solo. And so he starts with kind of like this hanging note, and then into the tremolo picking, and then into these hammer-ons, and then blah blah blah. But if you listen, the band has composed this together, right? So so it kind of starts off with da, 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 and then it's kind of like these hammer-on pull-offs, and then eventually the drums start coming in and like playing the subdivision of when he's going, he's doing like these like hammer-ons on two strings, and it's kind of like, oh, I know what that is. But the way the band put it together was like this whole thing and its intensity. And there's this one part of the solo where he just plays for 4 bars. He plays this singing, slower, melodic
Mm.
phrase that you can sing, and it's not out of place. And then he goes back into the intense thing, and then he builds up on that, like kind of two-hand tapping thing, or the pick skippy thing that goes all the way up. blows up exactly perfectly into the riff. So we're at the top, and it's one of those where a ton of notes and reckless playing was exactly what the tune needed. That's
That's
why I picked that one.
Yeah, that's great. I like that description. Uh, Reckless playing. Sometimes you got to be like leaning into something to where this is not what you're doing on guitar, but sometimes with physical movement you need to be like off balance a bit and moving forward with some momentum in order to get what you really need
And
out of
also,
something.
yeah, in like I remember like it being so epic and so arena rock. When I first got the record, I used to put on headphones and pretend I was in front of a whole audience playing that solo because it had so much. And it's not just the band. I mean, it's not just Sykes, it's the band. If you listen to
Yeah.
the solo again, listen to the bass and listen to the drums, they composed it, they worked it out.
I mean, with Whitesnake, you have a big band, right? You've got drum, bass, two guitarists, keyboardist, and
One guitarist when with
was there
that
only one at that time? Okay.
well
Because
for the
now I think it's so at that time they were like a classic 5 piece then, right?
but the
Um
tour had Vivian Campbell and Adrian Vandenberg.
okay,
So they did bring two
interesting.
guitarists. There's always two guitarists on the live tours, but on that it was
So
just
that they can play the riff while the solo's going on, right? I mean,
yeah.
what you see in a lot of recordings. I mean, so we're going to look at Sabbath in just a minute. A great example is Tony Iommi cannot play rhythm and lead at the same time, but on a lot of Black Sabbath recordings, just to mention Zero the Hero, he's got two tracks that he's playing. He's got his riff track and then he's got his soloing track. So how do you do that in concert? Well, you got to either just not play the riff and let the bassist handle it, or you got to have another guitarist somewhere.
Good point. Just to
Yeah.
interject, I love, although it sounds like it was recorded in a trash can, Dawkins Beast from the
Oh,
East.
I thought you were going to talk about maybe that's the connection there because Born Again is terrible production, right? I mean, it's a great album, but
Oh,
you
well,
know,
this live album, one guitar, and like, when he breaks off into his solo, you hear Pilson and the drums, and I don't miss the rhythm guitar. It's like they
yeah,
have
yeah.
like, and he's just going, like you could hear him going for it, this young energy, and it's just a cranked plexi, and he's just, you know, sometimes he'll like hit it out of the park, and it's just that whole concert is like you're on the edge of your seat because it's really raw, really live,
Yeah.
and
But you
it,
need a bassist like Jeff Pilson to pull that off. I
uh,
mean, there's some bassists that can do that and others that just can't fill up
you're
that
right.
sound.
Very good point.
So Ken says, this is a great one. Sign of the Southern Cross by
Oh,
Black Sabbath from the Dio era, right? So Tony Iommi had years and years, to like perfect his craft. Dio revitalized the band. Ken says technical, melodic, and feeds into Dio's singing. So yeah, I think that's quite true.
I think that's a good point about pointing out Dio's vocals and because I'm sure Dio's vocals changed how Tony played a little bit.
I think so. Yeah.
Like when you get around different musicians, you tend to play differently. In some respect, you still sound like you, but
I mean, when you have a musician like Dio who can have all of this stuff sort of figured out in his head, and I would say, like, let's say you imagine like you were getting to play with Steve Harris as your backup bassist, right? And it was just like maybe say, well, and I know that you're not as big of a fan of Nickel McBrain, so we'll replace him with Dead Clive Burr, right?
yes,
It'll be you and those guys, no singer, just you're going to play some instrumentals and stuff like that. I mean, when Steve Harris is behind you, you can do so much. When Dio is your singer, you can do so much. Um, I don't know that Ozzy ever. I mean, Ozzy's an okay singer, chops wise, and he's definitely Black Sabbath's first singer. I don't know that you can say that he and Tony Iommi have the kind of mutual connection that Dio and Iommi had on those two early albums and then their later album.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I would agree. Yeah, it always, in a situation like one of the things, if I were to, so let's say where I were to be in Maiden for a while, um, the first thing I'd have to do is find out where the time laid in the rhythm
Yeah,
section,
yeah,
because with each rhythm section, like when you play together for a long time, that's like everybody's feel kind of like locks and gels. So the first thing is the big challenge when you step into a rhythm section that's, spent decades getting there where they place the beat is finding out where that is so you lay in there
yeah,
correctly
yeah.
on everything, the rhythm parts. It's not just playing the parts, it's finding the time where it's laid. I mean, like feeling it. It's one thing hearing the records, it's another thing having it surround you while you're physically playing with them. So, but
Yeah,
yeah.
and I mean, this is a bit of a digression, and we're gonna have to close up
Yeah.
pretty soon. But I was just thinking about Ian Hill. He doesn't get the sort of like stature that Steve Harris does as a bassist, and Steve Harris is just a god. When it comes to bass, there's almost nobody who can compare to him. But Ian Hill is pretty damn good, and he has been there from the very beginning. I think that he's really the core of the band, and I wonder, when you have somebody who's been there that long, or in Black Sabbath, Tony Iommi is the core of the band. Geezer Butler, arguably, the second part of that. Um, and they, like you said, they've been doing this for decades. Getting to like come in and play with them, it's like going into a well-oiled machine, proverbial speaking, that has been happening and doing the same thing for years and years and years at a very high level. I think that it would be sort of a make or break moment, right? Either you measure up to it, or you can't fit in. And then, what does that say about you? That you're given this amazing opportunity to play with these really great players. Or I imagine if you could have, play in a band and you had John Lord on the organ, you
Hmm.
know?
I mean, a lot of it is, uh, that's why all-star bands don't always work
Oh yeah.
because they don't go well together.
Yeah, yeah.
I always say like it's, people that are into soccer, Brazil has the greatest players in the world, but they don't always really win games, because the team itself isn't
Yeah.
as good as other teams, even though they have the better players. But
Yeah. Well, we should wrap this up. Thanks so much to Ken and Mark for some
yeah,
great comments. And
as always, thank you.
yeah, and next time we are going to be interviewing Ken actually about one of those I was there type of moments pertaining to the new wave of British heavy metal. Scott and I could only kind of witness it from the other side of the pond, living out in the sticks, getting to see stuff in magazines and listening to, import albums.
That's
We
right.
missed a lot of what was actually happening. So I'm really looking forward to getting to chat about that. I think it'll probably be quite illuminating. Anything you want to say, Scott, to close us out?
Um, yeah, yeah, this was a great kind of exercise, and I hope, I invited a lot of people, but I hope to share this with students,
Oh yeah,
because this whole notion of you can have an opinion, but being able to express it. I think that was really kind of like we didn't say these are the 10 best guitar solos of all time. We just picked out things that solos that we really loved, and the big pieces explain why we
yeah,
like solo. And in just discussing it, a lot of different things came up, as they always do. It doesn't really stick to script altogether. We come up with new ideas and kind of like new thoughts and new challenges. What do you think of this? Oh, that's a good point. So I
yeah.
just, yeah, as usual, great discussion, and I always look forward to doing these. So that's it for me.